So, no matter what method you're using, there are some basic principles upon which the easy way to learn a language is based upon and which you have to stick to. The first principle is to work on a daily basis, or at least 5 days a week. No gigantic amount of work is required, just 30 minutes every day. An hour would be best for the first 3 months. It is much more effective in the long run to learn every day a little bit, rather than spend 2 whole days on books and audio CDs.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Can you imagine living in a world where somebody who was getting 24 hours a week of intensive language practice done, intensive language practice, intensive study, where they were just wasting their time compared to a friend of theirs who was only studying for 3.5 hours per week, because so dramatic was the advantage of spreading out the work being done into little segments of 30 minutes per day. If that claim were true, if it were even possible for this educational claim to be true, we would be living in a world where we were surrounded by evidence of this. When the U.S. military trains fighting men to speak a foreign language before going into combat, do you think the U.S. military has guidelines saying, oh, no, just 30 minutes per day or 1 hour per day? There's no point having people buckle down and study a language intensively for 6 hours a day or 12 hours a day. No. 30 minutes is more effective, not equally effective, more effective. The U.S. military would have data because every year they have to train thousands of people in dozens of different languages. United States Diplomatic Corps, Foreign Service, and many other countries that have a big budget for training their foreign service. Do you think that the diplomatic institutes of the world, whether for the United Nations or for a well-funded national government like the United States of America, do you think that they recommend people only study a language for 30 minutes a day, that they would claim it's more effective to spread out language learning into 30-minute chunks or even 1 hour chunks? This claim is so ridiculous that even if we double the numbers for one example and cut the other example in half, it remains ridiculous. Comparing 1 hour of work per day to 6 hours of work per day with the same distribution, one person working intensively on the weekend as opposed to the other person working in short spurts of time spread through it all 7 days of the week, there is no comparison. Fundamentally, language study, language research, language learning, language practice takes time. If you are able to put in 24 hours per week, you will make more rapid progress than someone who can only do 3.5 hours per week. You will have more depth and ability of the language. You will have more understanding of the language. You will have more ability, fluency, whatever measure you want to bring to bear here. And if you doubt that, prove me wrong. You show me the evidence. You show me the scientific or linguistic research anywhere in the world that shows that 3.5 hours per week can be more effective than 24 hours per week. That is just absurd. That is as dishonest a tactic as the proverbial snake oil salesman. And you may be able to sell that lie to suckers on the internet, to casual YouTube viewers who just want an excuse for their own sort of bad habits. 30 minutes a day is enough. That's what the nice man on YouTube said. Rightly or wrongly, 30 minutes per day is not the method being used by any elite university anywhere in the world. It's not the method being used by elite military organizations anywhere in the world. It's not the method being used by diplomatic training corps. Or another really good example, take a look at how airlines train flight staff, people who work on airplanes in the airline industry. Many of them have to, in a pretty short amount of time, learn a foreign language to a pretty high level of ability. Do you think they have their staff working 30 minutes a day? And If there were actually evidence of this, if it were more effective, if it were dramatically more effective to only study for 30 minutes a day, don't you think huge for-profit corporations like airlines, training airlines, don't you think they would notice? Don't you think they would care? Don't you think they'd adopt that more effective method? It's not more effective. That's why none of those institutions do it. You're just telling the audience something they want to hear.
The second principle is to learn in a natural way, as natural as possible. This way of getting into the real fabric of a language doesn't contemplate the use of horrible and heavy tones of grammar, which everybody's scared of. I'm not saying that grammar books are not useful, but as far as I see it, it is better to use them as a point of reference for thorough linguistical studies eventually, but not in self-teaching methods. I personally think that the use of these books might turn out to be discouraging sometimes.
This second claim, even more nakedly than the first, even more obviously and overtly than the first, is just appealing to what the audience wants to hear, and then is paradoxically insisting that because you want to hear it, because it would be convenient for you to believe, therefore it's more effective and more efficient as a way to learn a language. And if that were true, there would be evidence. And if we just let ourselves think logically about it for half a second, it's really impossible that there ever could be evidence of this kind. Now, the word natural is almost always fallacious. It can be used in a sincere sense. There's a difference between a grass lawn and a parking lot. Okay, one may be more natural than the other. But the idea that one method of learning a language is more natural than another, and that grammar is the opposite of nature, where is the evidence that withholding the teaching of grammar helps people to advance more quickly in the language? And how could this possibly be true of all languages equally? If you're learning Latin, Greek, Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, Cree, Ojibwe, the role of grammar and the importance of having an analytical understanding of grammatical concepts while you first memorize vocabulary can be crucially important, profoundly important from day one in the study of a language. And if there are exceptions to this rule, I would say they're just exceptions because the target language you're studying, the language you're trying to learn, is so similar to your own first language that you can ignore the grammar because it's implicitly obvious to you. If your first language is English and you start studying Dutch or German, you know what? You may be able to muddle by ignoring the grammar. But even so, that doesn't mean that you should. That doesn't mean that there's evidence that it's advantageous for you to ignore grammatical analysis and grammatical concepts in German, and then later to have to struggle to catch up and compensate for bad habits and misconceptions you've got.
Third principle is that learning a language should not be a stressful event, but a very pleasant one. Of course, hopefully. Wherever you feel under stress and you feel frustrated because you can't recall something you just learned a few days ago, relax and think that in some time, many of the problems you were facing at that moment will be ridiculously easy sometime later. So what I suggest when learning a language is to remember that it has to be a constant, natural, and pleasant way to learn.
This is very similar to the sort of dishonest pandering that goes on in the weight loss industry. Well, there's a lot of scientific evidence that counting the number of calories you eat is effective, that restricting and restraining the amount of food you eat by measuring it and calculating how many calories are involved, that's actually effective. That helps you gain weight. But of course, it's stressful. It's unpleasant. It's an annoyance. It's hard work. So there are all kinds of dishonest snake oil salesmen all over the internet who will want to sell you the myth, the half-truth, the lie that you can lose weight and have great results without counting calories. And of course, it's not impossible, but there is no scientific evidence to say that it will be more effective if you don't make that effort. Of course, I mean, you can learn a language with no methodology at all, with no effort at all. There are people who have a shipwreck, they end up marooned somewhere, living with people who speak another language, and after a few years go by, well, they somehow manage to learn the language with no textbooks and no teacher, just surviving. Yup, it's possible. It's also possible to lose weight and get in shape by surviving a shipwreck too, but I wouldn't recommend it. Being marooned on a desert island, yep, it can accomplish all these things and more. But what we're talking about here is what is effective. And those claims should be based on evidence, and we should have the integrity to come here on YouTube and say to you, both in discussing our own experience and in making generalizations about our students, about human nature on the scale of millions of people, what is effective, what is most effective, is almost never what is most pleasant, most relaxing, most enjoyable.
The written part is the fundamental key to the method, because it literally fixes the structure of the language in your brain through the effort of retranslating that language. This is very important. This phase can last a period ranging from 3 to 6 months, depending how you structure your work, how your schedule is. Writing down some grammar notes wouldn't be bad, actually. The second or intermediate phase is very similar to the elementary one. Just keep reading, listening, writing down, and retranslating dialects, but this phase is integrated with slightly more complicated texts, which also has to be written down in your native language and be translated into the language you're learning later. Here starts the advanced phase. At this point, the course you're following is finished, and what you have to do is simply watch movies with subtitles in spoken, and the spoken and the written part they have.
Plot twist. After reassuring us that the beginner level is going to be relaxing and easy and fun, and that the intermediate level is really just more of the same as the beginner level, the twist in the plot is the advanced level, according to his theory, is also relaxing and easy and fun. My warning still stands. This is somebody who is telling the audience what they want to hear. He is not telling the audience what they need to hear. I think that part of the problem with Luca is precisely that he is a polyglot who enjoys working on the simple fundamentals of a language and not doing advanced language research, language study, language practice. He's had the honesty to admit the extent of his failure with Japanese. I've also seen him reflect that today his ability to communicate in Polish is very, very limited. So many of the languages that he studied, he only had that early, thrilling ego trip of going from level 0 to level 1. And he didn't go through the much more denigrating, exhausting effort of, say, raising your ability in the language to being able to write a newspaper article that would be published for and read by native speakers of the language, right? That requires precision. That requires a sensitivity to the fine differences in meaning between different adjectives and different verbs, sounding compelling and so on. A whole lot would go into that level of use of the language that never goes into the sort of phrasebook knowledge that people like Luca and people like Laoshu 55,000, that these kind of YouTube language celebrities seem to glory in. What they seem to find rewarding is just going from level 0 to having the level of accomplishment that you'd feel comfortable getting out in an airport, talking to a taxi driver, going grocery shopping. And there is a sense in which that can be rewarding. There is a sense in which that's an ego trip. And I would also say there's a little bit of an ego trip, a little bit of a reward in first cracking the code for the phonetics of a language, for the writing system, of being the foreigner who can really get the vowel sounds right, whereas other foreigners are mispronouncing everything because they don't appreciate the language you do. Yeah, there's a little bit of an ego trip there. And when you get into the intermediate and advanced stages, that ego trip is gone, and the nature of the work, I think, is all the more exhausting and spirit-breaking. But we're not going to get any kind of honesty about that here. No. The fundamental problem here, as I've suggested again and again, is that this is someone who earns a living telling people what it is they want to hear, not necessarily what it is they need to hear. However, I have to confess, in the 21st century, encouragement is very hard to come by. I'm not surprised at all that people are lining up to pay 60 euros per hour in a package deal to get that little bit of encouragement, that little bit of guidance, that little bit of positivity in their lives. Because learning a language in a university environment is utterly lacking in that kind of encouragement. And people need it. People crave it. And for those of you who are learning a language without a university environment, working in the doleful isolation of the library, alone with your books and your audio recordings, I can completely understand why people are drawn to Luca and his positive, upbeat message. I completely understand why people would pay this bit of money just to hear some encouraging words for a few hours here and there to try to feel some sense of positive direction and motivation as they do this really demanding and terrible task. I sympathize, and I can reflect on my own life and what a positive difference it would have made for me if there were just one person encouraging me to keep on studying Cambodian when I was working on Cambodian as a language. If there were just one person helping me, encouraging me, in any way being kind and helpful to me when I was working on Cree and Ojibwe, tremendously difficult languages. I also need encouragement when I take on the terrible task of learning a language, and I'm sure that Luca is really fulfilling a very meaningful role in the lives of his students, of his pupils, of the people who pay him for that bit of encouragement.